The morning sun had barely lifted over the rolling hills when Willowbrook stirred into life. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of baking bread and damp earth, and the song of sparrows mingled with the distant toll of St. Margaret's church bells. It was the day of the annual village fair, and the small community that ordinarily moved with the measured cadence of domestic routines now hummed with an unusual energy. Tables were being arranged on the village green, each draped with crisp white cloths, adorned with the precise symmetry of homemade jams, carefully polished silver trophies, and bouquets of flowers gathered from gardens that had been tended with obsessive pride. The scent of fresh scones and apple tarts mingled with the earthy aroma of the wet grass. Children, ribbons in their hair and freckles on their noses, darted through the throng, squealing with laughter, while older gentlemen discussed the finer points of gardening and cricket scores in low, approving murmurs. Amid this cheerful commotion, Miss Jane Marple walked slowly along the path that led to the fair. Her soft, careful steps betrayed no haste, though her eyes, small, sharp, and unassuming, missed nothing. She carried her customary reticule and wore a hat that had seen many years but remained in impeccable order, the pale ribbon neatly tied. To the casual observer, she appeared merely to be another attendee, perhaps curious about the prize-winning exhibits or the tea-tent. Yet in truth she observed with a quiet intensity, noting the twitch of an eye, the nervous clasping of hands, the way certain villagers avoided one another's gaze. Mrs. Penrose, the fair's energetic organizer, spotted Miss Marple and hurried over, her cheeks pink with exertion and excitement. "Ah, Miss Marple!" she exclaimed, her voice tinged with relief. "You simply must help me judge the baking competition. Your keen eye is indispensable." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly, though a hint of amusement twinkled behind her spectacles. "I shall do my best, Mrs. Penrose, though I suspect the scones will be up to their usual standard." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the edge of the green. A shrill cry pierced the cheerful chatter. Heads turned. A small crowd began to gather, murmuring anxiously. Miss Marple's eyes, calm yet alert, followed the source of the disturbance. There, beneath the maypole festooned with ribbons, lay the motionless figure of Mr. Leonard Carraway, one of Willowbrook's more prosperous and occasionally abrasive residents. It was Mrs. Dobbins, the baker's wife, who knelt beside him, clutching her apron and muttering something incomprehensible. He's not moving. Oh, heavens, no! Instantly the atmosphere shifted. Laughter and light chatter were replaced by shocked gasps and whispered speculations. Children were ushered aside, and a few daring souls peeked over shoulders, trying to catch a glimpse without seeming too curious. The village, which had been a picture of serene rural harmony, now buzzed with fear and confusion. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She approached quietly, bending down just enough to observe without intrusion. Mr. Carraway's eyes were closed. His usually ruddy complexion had taken on an alarming pallor. The fair's excitement was replaced by a tense, almost reverent hush. Inspector Harrington, a tall, confident man from the nearby county town, arrived shortly thereafter, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and genuine concern. He was followed by Sergeant Mills, who looked as if he had not expected to encounter more than the occasional petty theft in Willowbrook. "Move back, please," Harrington instructed the gathering villagers, his voice firm but polite. "Is anyone trained in first aid?" A few women murmured that they could help, and the inspector nodded, stepping closer to examine Mr. Carraway. Meanwhile, Miss Marple remained at the fringe, her hands folded over her reticule, observing. She noted immediately something that the inspector overlooked: a faint smear of soil on the back of Mr. Carroway's cuff, a delicate crease in his trousers that suggested he had fallen awkwardly, and the subtle but telling angle of his body in relation to the maypole. Small things, seemingly trivial, yet in Miss Marple's mind they were threads that, when followed, might unravel the truth. Questions began to circulate among the villagers almost immediately. "Who could have done this?" Mrs. Penrose whispered, glancing at her neighbours with wide eyes. "Who would wish him harm?" "Perhaps an accident," suggested Mr. Grindle, the local butcher, nervously tugging at his waistcoat. But Miss Marple's intuition, honed over decades of observing human nature, told her otherwise. There was something deliberate in the way Mr. Carroway had fallen. It was not merely a slip or fainting spell, and in the tiny, almost imperceptible reactions of those gathered, she sensed a tension that spoke of secrets, grudges, and motives hidden beneath polite smiles. By the time the village doctor arrived and confirmed that Mr. Carroway was indeed dead, the fair had become a scene of quiet horror. The stalls remained oddly untouched, as if frozen in time. The laughter of children had ceased. The warm morning sun now seemed too bright, too cheerful, for the tragedy it shone upon. Miss Marple lingered for a moment longer, observing the faces around her, some shocked, some defensive, some strangely relieved. She noted who avoided eye contact, who whispered to whom, and whose hands shook ever so slightly. There were clues here in the smallest of details, and she would need them all if she were to uncover the truth. As the police began their inquiries, Miss Marple walked slowly back along the green, her mind quietly turning over the facts, her sharp eyes never missing a single detail. She did not speak aloud, for it was often in silence that one saw the clearest truths. And as she sipped her tea later that afternoon in her tidy sitting-room, she reflected on the paradoxical nature of Willowbrook. A village so calm, so proper, so gentle, yet capable of harbouring a darkness that none could have guessed. For Miss Marple, the fair was over, but the mystery had only just begun. By mid-morning, Willowbrook had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The fair stalls stood half forgotten, their vibrant displays of jam, cakes, and homemade crafts largely ignored, while clusters of villagers huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones, glancing nervously toward the green where Mr. Leonard Carroway's body had been taken. The bright spring day felt oddly muted, as though the sun itself was wary of casting warmth on a village shaken by death. Miss Marple, having taken her customary morning stroll, paused near the entrance to the churchyard. Here she found Mrs. Dobbins and her sister-in-law, two women who could scarcely speak for worry, muttering about how impossible it was, and who could have done such a thing. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Mrs. Dobbins started, her hands clutching the folds of her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, simply dreadful. Poor Leonard. He was always so difficult, I suppose, but never like this." Miss Marple's eyes, mild yet penetrating, regarded her for a moment. "Yes, it is very sad, but often, you know, the truth is not what it first appears to be. Do you remember if anything unusual occurred yesterday? Perhaps at the fair, or in the days leading up to it?" Mrs. Dobbins hesitated. "Well, there was a disagreement between him and Mr. Grindle, I think, about the prize-winning apple pies. But it's nothing really, just village quarrels. Village quarrels often contain more than meets the eye," Miss Marple said with a soft, knowing smile. She took note of the nervous glance Mrs. Dobbins cast toward the other villagers and stored it quietly in her mind. News of the death travelled faster than the fair itself. By mid-morning, every shop and home seemed to be buzzing with speculation. The baker's dozen of gossiping women at Mrs. Penrose's tea-house debated endlessly over tea and scones, while men in tweed jackets and waistcoats muttered over the morning paper about what they had, or had not, seen. "He simply collapsed," one villager claimed, shaking his head. "I heard he'd been unwell for weeks. No one could have done anything." "Unwell indeed," another scoffed. "He was arguing with young Thomas Willoughby about that land deal. I'd say there's more to it than fainting spells." Miss Marple, passing quietly by, overheard snippets of the conversation, but said nothing. She did not need to speak to know that tensions, resentments, and rivalries were bubbling just beneath Willowbrook's tidy surface. Meanwhile, Inspector Harrington had begun his investigation in earnest. His approach, brisk and confident, was designed to bring swift order to what he assumed was a straightforward case. He spoke to the villagers methodically, asking who had seen Mr. Carroway last, who had any quarrels with him, and whether anyone had noticed anything unusual during the fair. Many villagers, anxious to protect their reputations or simply caught in the fear of suspicion, offered only half-truths. It did not take long for a suspect to emerge. Young Thomas Willoughby, the local landowner's son, had been seen arguing with Mr. Carroway the day before. The details were murky, but a heated exchange was reported near the edge of the green. Combined with Mr. Carroway's notoriously cantankerous disposition, it was easy, in the inspector's eyes, to draw a swift conclusion. Thomas, a pale and nervous young man, was soon summoned. He stammered through the questioning, insisting he had left the fair early and had no reason to harm Mr. Carroway. Yet his furtive glances and trembling hands seemed to confirm the villagers' suspicions. Miss Marple observed all of this from a discreet distance. Her mind, as always, pieced together subtle details that others overlooked. The crease in Thomas's jacket did not match the scene of the supposed altercation. His shoes were clean, free of the grass stains that might have been expected if he had wrestled or struggled near the maypole. And there was the matter of Mr. Carroway's cuff, soil smudged just so, as if he had been pushed from a certain angle. She shook her head quietly, not in doubt of her own mind, but in mild amusement at the inspector's eagerness to simplify what was, in reality, far from simple. Village life, she knew, was often a web of hidden motives, long-held grudges, and secrets that could easily masquerade as accidents. By afternoon, gossip had reached fever pitch. The grocer's wife claimed Mr. Carroway had quarrelled with nearly everyone in the village at some point. The postmistress recounted rumours of a mysterious visitor seen lingering near his house days before the fair, and Mrs. Penrose, frantic with concern over the ruined fete, fretted about the effect on the village's reputation. Miss Marple, having taken tea in the quiet of her sitting-room, reflected on the strands of information she had gathered. Each snippet, each nervous glance, each hushed whisper was a piece of a larger puzzle. It was far too early to speak aloud, yet she sensed that the threads were beginning to converge. Something about Mr. Carroway's death did not add up. Something deliberate, carefully concealed. And so, as the day waned and shadows stretched across Willowbrook's tidy streets, the village remained a hive of speculation, while one sharp-eyed observer quietly began to trace the path toward the truth. Miss Marple, seated at her window and knitting with slow, deliberate motions, allowed her mind to wander over the villagers' behaviours, their words, their gestures. She understood better than most that the calmest villages often harboured the darkest secrets, and that the smallest detail, the quietest observation, might yet reveal the murderer lurking among them. The fair was over, the inspector confident in his presumptions, the villagers whispering in fear, and yet Miss Marple knew that the true story had only just begun to unfold. The morning after the fair, Willowbrook awoke under a haze of muted whispers. The sun rose as usual, illuminating cobblestone paths and neat gardens, but the village's cheerful rhythm had been replaced by a subdued, tense quiet. The green where Mr. Leonard Carraway had fallen was empty now, cordoned off with simple wooden stakes and a hastily strung rope, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had shaken the community. Even the birds seemed hesitant, their song slower, as if acknowledging the unease that hung over the village. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, leading past the post office and into the narrow high street. Her mind was busy, weaving together the fragments of yesterday's events. It was not her habit to rush to judgment. Rather, she collected details like the careful arranging of a quilt, one small patch at a time, each stitch revealing a pattern only the observant could see. Passing by the grocer's shop, she noticed that the shutters were half closed and the proprietor, Mr. Hargreaves, was speaking in low tones with a young assistant. The tone of their conversation was urgent yet cautious, eyes darting toward the lane, as if the mere presence of a passer-by might compromise some confidential matter. Miss Marple, walking slowly, adjusted her spectacles and noted the subtle tension in the man's posture, the stiffness in his hands. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, but enough to make her think. She continued to the church, where the Reverend Albright was preparing for a small memorial service. The rector had a kindly face and an air of constant mild anxiety, but even he could not conceal the twitch in his left hand, the furrow in his brow, that betrayed a deeper concern than the simple duties of remembrance. "Good morning, Reverend," Miss Marple said softly, pausing at the entrance. "I imagine you are very busy today." The Reverend inclined his head, sighing. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Indeed, the village is unsettled. I dare say I have never witnessed such shock, and so many conflicting accounts of the incident. Yes," she murmured, "and often the confusion itself contains a truth. People are eager to fill in gaps with assumptions, and it is those assumptions that can be misleading." He gave a small nod, perhaps not fully grasping the subtle wisdom in her words, but appreciative nonetheless. Miss Marple's next stop was the Carraway estate. Though the house itself was private, the gardens that bordered the lane offered her a vantage point. She observed quietly, a gate slightly ajar, a few trampled flowers near the front walk, and most tellingly, a small patch of soil that looked disturbed, as if someone had hastily attempted to erase a footprint. It was minute, almost invisible to an untrained eye, yet it spoke to her instinct. The death had not been entirely accidental, and someone had already begun to cover tracks. Back in the village square, she paused to listen. Conversations were murmured, deliberate, but always tinged with unease. The local baker's wife fretted over lost orders. The tailor whispered about a strange visitor seen the night before. Even the children, usually bright and careless, appeared subdued, sensing the weight of the day. Miss Marple noted each gesture, the nervous tugging of a sleeve, the way one woman constantly glanced over her shoulder, the stiff, forced smiles exchanged between neighbours. Every movement, she knew, had meaning. Later in the afternoon, she ventured to the home of Thomas Willoughby. His mother, a dignified woman with sharp eyes, greeted her at the door. Though polite, there was an undercurrent of tension, as if she anticipated interrogation. Miss Marple, however, spoke only gently, commenting on the beauty of the garden and the unusual weather. While chatting, her keen eyes caught a detail that might have escaped anyone else. A faint scuff mark on the floorboards near the window, a slight displacement of a potted plant, and a small ribbon caught in the bush beneath. These were minor anomalies, almost trivial in isolation, yet they hinted at hurried movement or a struggle, something that had occurred unnoticed during the fair or in the immediate aftermath. It was not merely observation, Miss Marple knew, but patience that revealed the puzzle. By evening, she had accumulated a quiet dossier of clues, subtle gestures, inconsistencies in the villagers' accounts, small traces of disturbance in familiar spaces. None of these would have drawn attention from the inspector or the villagers, who were more interested in expedient conclusions, but to her they formed a tapestry of human behaviour that suggested motive, opportunity and intent. As she returned home, walking along the quiet lanes lined with blooming hedges, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of the case. Something was amiss beyond the apparent quarrel between Thomas Willoughby and Mr. Carraway. There were layers, hidden emotions, and unspoken resentments beneath the village's polite surface. In the stillness of her sitting-room that evening, she set down her knitting and allowed herself a rare, small smile. The threads were there, just as she had anticipated, waiting to be carefully traced, and Miss Marple, with her patient mind and sharp perception, knew that the unravelling of Willowbrook's darkest secrets had only just begun. By the following morning, Willowbrook was in full whispering mode. Word had spread that young Thomas Willoughby was under suspicion. Inspector Harrington had decided, rather decisively in the eyes of the villagers, that the quarrel between Thomas and Mr. Carraway provided sufficient motive, and the arrest was made quietly at his family home. Thomas, pale and trembling, had been led away in the inspector's car, while a cluster of onlookers murmured among themselves, trading glances that mingled relief, fear, and curiosity. Miss Marple watched the proceedings from the edge of the square, her expression calm, yet her mind was anything but idle. She had expected the inspector to settle on the most obvious suspect. That was his way, methodical, confident, and often overly eager to conclude a case. But to Miss Marple, the evidence against Thomas seemed thin, circumstantial at best. The boy's nervousness, his awkward stammering, were as much the marks of innocence as they were of guilt, and there were details the inspector had entirely overlooked. Subtle inconsistencies in timelines, overlooked gestures, and small disturbances in the surroundings of the fair. The village reacted as one might expect. Some were relieved that a culprit had been found, believing the matter closed. Others whispered anxiously, sensing that the truth was far from simple. Mrs. Penrose fretted that the fair's reputation was irreparably tarnished. The grocer shook his head, muttering about how you never know a person in these villages until tragedy strikes. Inside the Willoughby household, the atmosphere was tense. Mrs. Willoughby, dignified yet clearly distressed, busied herself with tea and biscuits for the inspector, who asked formal questions in his clipped, precise manner. Thomas's father, a stern man with greying hair, paced the room with barely concealed agitation, yet neither parent could provide the sort of proof Harrington desired. "What do you have against him?" Mrs. Willoughby asked sharply when the inspector suggested the quarrel had been serious. Thomas was angry, yes, but to imagine he could harm Mr. Carraway. Absurd! Inspector Harrington's jaw tightened. "We must consider motive, madam. Your son had a clear dispute with the deceased. It is standard procedure to examine those closest to the events." Miss Marple, meanwhile, strolled quietly to the nearby lane, where the whispers of the villagers were almost tangible. "I heard he saw someone leaving the green late yesterday," murmured Mrs. Dobbins to the baker's wife, "and there was a stranger in the village." "Thomas would never," began another voice, but a glance from the speaker's neighbour silenced them. Fear, caution, and curiosity were tightly intertwined in every whispered sentence. Later, at her home, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The villagers' gossip, while often exaggerated, carried kernels of truth, and it was in those kernels, tiny fragments overlooked by the police, that the outline of the real story might be found. She recalled the faint scuff near the Caraway estate, the small patch of disturbed soil, the subtle crease in Thomas's jacket, the misplaced ribbon by the bush, details that, to anyone else, seemed inconsequential, but to her mind were puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. By afternoon, she decided to make discreet inquiries of her own. First, she visited Mrs. Penrose, who was frantic with worry over ruined plans for the fair and the growing anxiety of the villagers. Miss Marple asked gentle, unassuming questions about the day of the fair. Who had arrived when? Who had lingered near the green? Who had been unusually nervous? Mrs. Penrose responded in her distracted manner, with partial answers and a few nervous glances toward the street, revealing the cracks in the careful facade of village calm. Next, Miss Marple strolled past the Caraway estate once more, noting a maid dusting the entrance hall. With a polite smile, she asked casually about the household routines, whether Mr. Caraway had received any visitors the previous day, and whether any unusual noises or disturbances had been noticed. The maid, shy and nervous, hesitated, then mentioned a gentleman in a dark coat lingering near the garden path late in the afternoon, a detail she had not thought important until now. Each thread, each whispered comment seemed insignificant on its own, but Miss Marple, with her patient mind, was beginning to see the subtle weave of events. The arrest of Thomas Willoughby, she suspected, was a premature conclusion. The real truth, she knew, would reveal itself not through the obvious quarrels and tensions, but through careful attention to small, almost invisible details, movements, gestures, the quiet truths that people left behind, even as they tried to conceal them. As twilight fell across Willowbrook, Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, sipping tea, her sharp eyes peering out the window at the dimly lit streets. She had begun to map the intricate network of human behaviour, motives and secrets that hid behind polite smiles and anxious whispers. Somewhere among them was the murderer, and she, with her subtle understanding of human nature, would find the clues that others could not see. The village had moved on outwardly, the police confident in their suspect, the villagers whispering behind closed doors. But Miss Marple understood that the quiet corners, the fleeting gestures, and the hushed confessions of conscience often held the key to unravelling the deepest mysteries. And in Willowbrook, as in any small village, nothing remained hidden forever. The days following the arrest of Thomas Willoughby were a strange mixture of routine and tension in Willowbrook. Life went on in its quiet, orderly fashion. Gardens were tended, letters posted, children sent off to school. But beneath the polite facades, a current of fear and suspicion pulsed through the village. Everyone seemed to glance over their shoulders, as though expecting another tragedy to strike. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual unhurried grace, observing without intrusion. She had begun to visit a few key villages under the pretext of casual calls. A cup of tea here, a word of sympathy there. She asked questions in the gentlest way, often about trivial matters, while carefully noting the responses, hesitations, and subtle gestures that betrayed more than words ever could. Her first visit was to Mrs. Dobbins, still shaken by the events at the fair. The baker's wife wrung her hands nervously as she offered Miss Marple a cup of tea. "I don't understand, Miss Marple," she said. "How could Leonard— well, how could this happen? Everyone liked him, or at least everyone pretended to." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Ah, yes, Appearances, my dear Mrs. Dobbins, can be very misleading. People often hide things even from themselves. The heart of a village can be as secretive as its hedgerows. Mrs. Dobbins, glancing toward the window, as if the very walls might be listening, whispered, "There were arguments, of course. Leonard had his tempers, and there's always the matter of the late Mr. Penrose's estate. Leonard did have his eye on a little of that property, I'm sure, but I would never have thought—" Her voice trailed off, uncertain whether to continue. Miss Marple's interest was piqued. Property disputes and hidden ambitions often provided fertile ground for motives, especially in a village where family and land were intertwined for generations. She made a mental note to investigate further, quietly, without alarming anyone. Her next stop was the postmistress, Mrs. Withers, who had an uncanny ability to know everyone's comings and goings. Mrs. Withers, though usually tight-lipped, relaxed in Miss Marple's presence, speaking more freely than she had with the police. "I saw Mr. Carraway speaking to a stranger 2 days before the fair," she said. "Tall man, dark coat, didn't seem like someone from Willowbrook. And I thought it strange how quickly Leonard seemed to dismiss the conversation when he returned inside." Miss Marple's mind noted the detail carefully. A visitor, unknown to the village, arriving shortly before the murder. That was an element the inspector had not considered, and Miss Marple knew well that newcomers, even brief ones, could ignite old grievances or provide the opportunity for a carefully orchestrated crime. That evening, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Willoughby, the mother of the accused, to gauge the young man's behaviour and the household atmosphere. The air was tense, her concern palpable, but a few inconsistencies in the household routine drew Miss Marple's attention. A window that was usually latched was left slightly ajar. A cupboard where a small box had been stored seemed disturbed. Subtle signs, easy to dismiss by those preoccupied with fear, but far too telling to a patient observer. Meanwhile, gossip in the village swirled like autumn leaves in a gust. Mrs. Penrose fretted over the ruined fair, speculating aloud to anyone who would listen. The grocer claimed Mr. Carraway had enemies in nearly every corner of Willowbrook, people who might gain by his untimely demise. Even the children, though shielded from the harshest details, whispered rumours, repeating overheard phrases that distorted events in ways both humorous and unsettling. As Miss Marple moved through these quiet inquiries, she began to discern patterns. Hidden rivalries over property, lingering resentments over past slights, subtle interactions that revealed tensions not visible in the public eye. All were threads in a tapestry that only she could see in its entirety. The simple quarrel between Thomas Willoughby and Mr. Carraway was, she suspected, a convenient distraction, a decoy that drew attention away from the true perpetrator. By nightfall, she returned to her sitting room, knitting needles clicking softly as she contemplated her discoveries. She had the names, the motives, the whispered hints. She knew, as always, that the key lay not in what people admitted, but in what they could not help revealing. The village, outwardly calm in its evening routine, hid beneath its tidy surface a web of secrets, grievances, and ambitions. Miss Marple, quietly patient, would trace each strand with the precision of one accustomed to reading the subtleties of human nature. And among those strands, she felt certain, lay the person who had brought death to Willowbrook's fair, a person who believed that appearances could forever mask the truth. As the lamp flickered softly in her sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The game was far from over. It was a damp grey morning when Willowbrook awoke to news that sent an uneasy shiver through the village. A second incident had occurred, less dramatic than the death of Mr. Leonard Carraway. yet unsettling enough to disturb the fragile calm. Mrs. Dobbins, rushing to her bakery with flour-dusted hands, had discovered that a valuable silver tray, long kept for ceremonial use during village events, was missing. The tray was not merely a kitchen utensil, it was a symbol of the fair's tradition, passed down through generations, and its sudden disappearance carried a weight that even the simplest minds in Willowbrook could feel. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea as she absorbed the news, was unsurprised. In her experience, the small villages of England often revealed their truths not all at once, but in stages, each incident peeling back another layer of appearances. The disappearance of the tray, she suspected, might be more than a petty theft. It could be a signal, an intentional diversion, or even a clue left by the perpetrator of Mr. Carroway's death. By mid-morning, Inspector Harrington arrived, frowning over the new development. He questioned Mrs. Dobbins thoroughly, noting the locked cupboards and the routine of the bakery. But the clues were scarce. "It's probably just a petty thief," he concluded aloud, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. The two events are likely unrelated. Miss Marple, however, did not share his confidence. She lingered near the bakery, subtly questioning villagers who happened to pass, listening more than speaking. A pattern began to emerge. Several witnesses mentioned seeing a stranger near the village green not long before the fair, perhaps the same man Mrs. Withers had spoken of, and a few also noted him lingering near the Carroway estate afterward. These were details that most villagers had dismissed, considering them unimportant. Miss Marple, however, filed them away carefully, aware that small inconsistencies often became the key to solving a puzzle. Later that afternoon, she visited Thomas Willoughby, now confined at the local police station. Though frightened and confused, the young man provided unexpected insight. I don't know anything about the tray," he stammered, "but I did see a man. He wasn't from around here. He came to the fair the day before everything happened. I saw him near Mr. Carroway's stall, and then he was gone. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. The boy's words confirmed what she had suspected. The true culprit had been moving quietly, carefully, and with purpose. Thomas's nervousness, she reminded herself, had been innocence, not guilt. Determined to gather further information, she walked through the village in the late afternoon, noting every subtle movement, every furtive glance, every hurried whisper. At the churchyard, she observed that a small section of the hedge bordering the Carroway estate had been disturbed. A closer inspection revealed faint footprints pressed into the soft earth. Prints too small for the young Willoughby, but consistent with a slight, deliberate tread. By evening, Miss Marple had compiled a mental map of the comings and goings of that crucial day. The stranger, the overlooked details of the fair, and now the missing tray, all formed a network of hints pointing toward a methodical, careful mind behind both the death and the theft. She returned home, the lamp casting soft shadows across her sitting room, and began to lay out the threads of her thoughts. 2 incidents, she murmured, both calculated, one meant to kill, the other, perhaps to mislead, to test, or even to taunt, and both rely on the complacency of the villagers who see only what they expect to see. Outside, Willowbrook settled into uneasy twilight. The streets were quiet, the gardens bathed in a dim silvery light. Yet beneath the surface, tension and secrets churned. Miss Marple, as always, observed silently. She understood, as no one else in the village yet did, that the second disturbance was a deliberate stroke in a larger design, and that the next few days would reveal far more than anyone anticipated. For the murderer, the trap was forming, but it was Miss Marple who would guide the threads to a conclusion, unseen, patient, and meticulously observant. The morning sun rose gently over Willowbrook, casting long, dappled shadows across the village lanes and the neatly trimmed hedges of the Carraway estate. Despite the brightness, the village moved with a quieted pace. Children tiptoed past the empty green, and villagers spoke in subdued tones, aware that suspicion lingered like an unwelcome fog. The arrest of Thomas Willoughby still hung over the community, a tense shadow over each polite smile and stiff nod. Miss Marple, however, felt a quiet reassurance. Patience was her ally, and observation her tool. Sitting at her window with a cup of tea, she reviewed in her mind the sequence of events. Mr. Carraway's untimely death, the heated exchange with Thomas Willoughby, the mysterious stranger seen near the fair, and now the stolen silver tray. Each incident, she realized, was not isolated but part of a carefully orchestrated pattern. By mid-morning, she began her methodical inquiries. First, she called on the postmistress, Mrs. Withers, to revisit the account of the stranger. "Tell me again, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "about the gentleman in the dark coat. When exactly did you see him, and where was he headed?" Mrs. Withers adjusted her spectacles nervously. "I saw him near the green just before the fair began. He seemed interested in the stalls, particularly Mr. Carraway's. Then he walked along the lane toward the estate. It was peculiar. He didn't speak to anyone, and he lingered as if he were making sure of something." Miss Marple nodded quietly, storing each detail. The stranger's behaviour suggested deliberation, an intent that was both deliberate and subtle. He had studied the village, observed the routines, and timed his actions carefully. Next, she visited Mrs. Dobbins, whose nervous energy often spilled into useful information. She inquired again about the day of the fair and any unusual behaviours she had noticed. Mrs. Dobbins recalled seeing Mr. Carraway shake hands with someone briefly, a man she did not recognize. His hand lingered longer than customary, and she thought she saw the faintest smirk on Mr. Carraway's face, a hint, perhaps, that some private understanding had passed between them. With these details, Miss Marple began to trace a timeline in her mind. Mr. Carraway had interacted with the stranger, then returned to his usual haunts, where small disturbances, trampled flowers, displaced objects, a smear of soil on his cuff, hinted at interference. By the time the fair began, the trap was already set, subtle but effective. Miss Marple's keen attention next turned to the Willoughby estate. Though Thomas remained in police custody, the household itself was a source of minor anomalies. A misplaced ribbon in the garden, a small scuff on the threshold of the front door, and the faint scent of tobacco, odd for the family, who were not regular smokers, all suggested movements that were carefully disguised, meant to mislead any casual observer, sauf drôle. She had completed a discreet survey of the village's habitual patterns. Villagers passed each other with polite nods, some glancing too quickly, others lingering just long enough to observe what might be concealed. Miss Marple noted every twitch of the eye, every nervous shift of weight, and every hesitation in speech. It was in these small human details that truth resided, invisible to those who relied solely on appearances. Her thoughts returned to the stolen tray. It was more than a theft. It was deliberate misdirection. The thief had known that the disappearance would draw attention, creating an illusion of petty crime that would distract from the true motive behind Mr. Carraway's death. Miss Marple could see the psychological design at work. A careful manipulation of the villagers' perceptions, a subtle orchestration of fear and suspicion. As the day waned, she took her usual evening stroll through the village lanes. her mind quietly assembling the pieces. She imagined the movements of the stranger, the interactions of the villagers, and the concealed rivalries that pulsed beneath Willowbrook's serene surface. Every small detail, the angle of a gaze, the subtle twist of a hand, the hesitation in speech, was a thread, and she intended to follow each one until the tapestry of the truth was fully revealed. Returning home, Miss Marple poured herself a second cup of tea, her knitting forgotten for the moment. She allowed her mind to drift through the delicate lattice of human behaviour, testing each thread, weighing each inconsistency. Somewhere among them lay the person who had sought to kill and to mislead, the person who believed they could move through the village undetected. But Miss Marple, with her patient vigilance and her understanding of human nature, had already begun to tighten the invisible web. The truth, she knew, could not long remain hidden in Willowbrook, not when every action left traces, however small, for a careful observer to uncover, and so the village, outwardly calm, continued its polite routines, while Miss Marple quietly mapped the shadows, tracking subtle patterns, hidden tensions, and the faint traces of a mind more cunning than any they had yet suspected. The following morning, Willowbrook awoke to a gentle drizzle, the streets slick with lingering dew. The dampness did little to dampen the undercurrent of tension that still gripped the village. Though life appeared ordinary, shopkeepers opening doors, children trudging to school, the occasional dog bark echoing down narrow lanes, the events of the fair and Mr. Carroway's death lingered like a shadow over every corner. Miss Marple, as usual, took her morning walk before breakfast, pausing to observe subtle details that others would have ignored. A servant sweeping the steps of the Carroway estate had her broom angled unusually, as if to conceal something beneath it. A pair of women speaking in low tones outside the post office laughed too quickly, their expressions not entirely matching the cheerful notes of their words. Her first call was to Mrs. Penrose, the organizer of the fair, who greeted her with a frazzled smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all still such a mess," she fretted. "The fair, the scandal, it's all too much." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, allowing her eyes to wander over the arrangement of cups and saucers. "Tell me, my dear, was there anyone at the fair yesterday who seemed unusually attentive to Mr. Carroway's movements?" Mrs. Penrose hesitated, her hands wringing a handkerchief. "Well, there was a man. I didn't recognize him. Tall, dark coat. He seemed to drift from stall to stall, observing everything. I thought him peculiar, but the fair was busy." By mid-morning, Inspector Harrington arrived, frowning over the new development. He questioned Mrs. Dobbins thoroughly, noting the locked cupboards and the routine of the bakery, but the clues were scarce. "It's probably just a petty thief," he concluded aloud, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "The two events are likely unrelated." Miss Marple, however, did not share his confidence. She lingered near the bakery, subtly questioning villagers who happened to pass, listening more than speaking. A pattern began to emerge. Several witnesses mentioned seeing a stranger near the village green not long before the fair. Perhaps the same man Mrs. Withers had spoken of, and a few also noted him lingering near the Carroway estate afterward. These were details that most villagers had dismissed, considering them unimportant. Miss Marple, however, filed them away carefully, aware that small inconsistencies often became the key to solving a puzzle. Later that afternoon, she visited Thomas Willoughby, now confined at the local police station. Though frightened and confused, the young man provided unexpected insight. I don't know anything about the tray," he stammered, "but I did see a man. He wasn't from around here. He came to the fair the day before everything happened. I saw him near Mr. Carroway's stall, and then he was gone. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. The boy's words confirmed what she had suspected. The true culprit had been moving quietly, carefully, and with purpose. Thomas's nervousness, she reminded herself, had been innocence, not guilt, determined to gather further information. She walked through the village in the late afternoon, noting every subtle movement, every furtive glance, every hurried whisper. At the churchyard, she observed that a small section of the hedge bordering the Carroway estate had been disturbed. A closer inspection revealed faint footprints pressed into the soft earth. Prints too small for the young Willoughby, but consistent with a slight, deliberate tread. By evening, Miss Marple had compiled a mental map of the comings and goings of that crucial day. The stranger, the overlooked details of the fair, and now the missing tray, all formed a network of hints pointing toward a methodical, careful mind behind both the death and the theft. She returned home, the lamp casting soft shadows across her sitting room, and began to lay out the threads of her thoughts. 2 incidents, she murmured, both calculated, one meant to kill the other, perhaps to mislead, to test, or even to taunt. And both rely on the complacency of the villagers, who see only what they expect to see. Outside, Willowbrook settled into uneasy twilight. The streets were quiet, the gardens bathed in a dim silvery light. Yet beneath the surface, tension and secrets churned. Miss Marple, as always, observed silently. She understood, as no one else in the village yet did, that the second disturbance was a deliberate stroke in a larger design, and that the next few days would reveal far more than anyone anticipated. For the murderer, the trap was forming, but it was Miss Marple who would guide the threads to a conclusion, unseen, patient, and meticulously observant. The morning sun rose gently over Willowbrook, casting long, dappled shadows across the village lanes and the neatly trimmed hedges of the Carroway estate. Despite the brightness, the village moved with a quieted pace. Children tiptoed past the empty green, and villagers spoke in subdued tones, aware that suspicion lingered like an unwelcome fog. The arrest of Thomas Willoughby still hung over the community, a tense shadow over each polite smile and stiff nod. Miss Marple, however, felt a quiet reassurance. Patience was her ally, and observation her tool. Sitting at her window with a cup of tea, she reviewed in her mind the sequence of events. Mr. Carroway's untimely death, the heated exchange with Thomas Willoughby, the mysterious stranger seen near the fair, and now the stolen silver tray. Each incident, she realized, was not isolated, but part of a carefully orchestrated pattern. By mid-morning, she began her methodical inquiries. First, she called on the postmistress, Mrs. Withers, to revisit the account of the stranger. "Tell me again, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "about the gentleman in the dark coat. When exactly did you see him, and where was he headed?" Mrs. Withers adjusted her spectacles nervously. "I saw him near the green just before the fair began. He seemed interested in the stalls, particularly Mr. Carroway's. Then he walked along the lane toward the estate. It was peculiar. He didn't speak to anyone, and he lingered as if he were making sure of something." Miss Marple nodded quietly, storing each detail. The stranger's behaviour suggested deliberation, an intent that was both deliberate and subtle. He had studied the village, observed the routines, and timed his actions carefully. Next, she visited Mrs. Dobbins, whose nervous energy often spilled into useful information. She inquired again about the day of the fair and any unusual behaviours she had noticed. Mrs. Dobbins recalled seeing Mr. Carroway shake hands with someone briefly, a man she did not recognize. His hand lingered longer than customary, and she thought she saw the faintest smirk on Mr. Carroway's face, a hint, perhaps, that some private understanding had passed between them. With these details, Miss Marple began to trace a timeline in her mind. Mr. Carroway had interacted with the stranger, then returned to his usual haunts, where small disturbances, trampled flowers, displaced objects, a smear of soil on his cuff, hinted at interference. By the time the fair began, the trap was already set, subtle but effective. Miss Marple's keen attention next turned to the Willoughby estate. Though Thomas remained in police custody, the household itself was a source of minor anomalies. A misplaced ribbon in the garden, a small scuff on the threshold of the front door, and the faint scent of tobacco. Odd for the family, who were not regular smokers. All suggested movements that were carefully disguised, meant to mislead any casual observer. By afternoon, she had completed a discreet survey of the village's habitual patterns. Villagers passed each other with polite nods, some glancing too quickly, others lingering just long enough to observe what might be concealed. Miss Marple noted every twitch of the eye, every nervous shift of weight, and every hesitation in speech. It was in these small human details that truth resided, invisible to those who relied solely on appearances. Her thoughts returned to the stolen tray. It was more than a theft. It was deliberate misdirection. The thief had known that the disappearance would draw attention, creating an illusion of petty crime that would distract from the true motive behind Mr. Carroway's death. Miss Marple could see the psychological design at work. A careful manipulation of the villagers' perceptions, a subtle orchestration of fear and suspicion. As the day waned, she took her usual evening stroll through the village lanes, her mind quietly assembling the pieces. She imagined the movements of the stranger, the interactions of the villagers, and the concealed rivalries that pulsed beneath Willowbrook's serene surface. Every small detail, the angle of a gaze, the subtle twist of a hand, the hesitation in speech, was a thread, and she intended to follow each one until the tapestry of the truth was fully revealed. Returning home, Miss Marple poured herself a second cup of tea, her knitting forgotten for the moment. She allowed her mind to drift through the delicate lattice of human behaviour, testing each thread, weighing each inconsistency. Somewhere among them lay the person who had sought to kill and to mislead, the person who believed they could move through the village undetected. But Miss Marple, with her patient vigilance and her understanding of human nature, had already begun to tighten the invisible web. The truth, she knew, could not long remain hidden in Willowbrook, not when every action left traces, however small, for a careful observer to uncover, and so the village, outwardly calm, continued its polite routines, while Miss Marple quietly mapped the shadows, tracking subtle patterns, hidden tensions, and the faint traces of a mind more cunning than any they had yet suspected. The following morning, Willowbrook awoke to a gentle drizzle, the streets slick with lingering dew. The dampness did little to dampen the undercurrent of tension that still gripped the village. Though life appeared ordinary, shopkeepers opening doors, children trudging to school, the occasional dog bark echoing down narrow lanes, the events of the fair and Mr. Carroway's death lingered like a shadow over every corner. Miss Marple, as usual, took her morning walk before breakfast, pausing to observe subtle details that others would have ignored. A servant sweeping the steps of the Carroway estate had her broom angled unusually, as if to conceal something beneath it. A pair of women speaking in low tones outside the post office laughed too quickly, their expressions not entirely matching the cheerful notes of their words. Her first call was to Mrs. Penrose, the organizer of the fair, who greeted her with a frazzled smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all still such a mess," she fretted. The fair, the scandal. It's all too much. Indeed, Miss Marple replied softly, allowing her eyes to wander over the arrangement of cups and saucers. Tell me, my dear, was there anyone at the fair yesterday who seemed unusually attentive to Mr. Carraway's movements? Mrs. Penrose hesitated, her hands wringing a handkerchief. Well, there was a man. I didn't recognize him. Tall, dark coat. He seemed to drift from stall to stall, observing everything. I thought him peculiar, but the fair was busy. Reverend Pettigrew stiffened. Idle speculation, he said sharply. It's most improper. But Miss Marple caught the quick flush in his cheeks, the faint tremor in his hands as he reached for his teacup. Such small betrayals of composure never escaped her notice. She smiled pleasantly. Oh, yes, money does have such a way of entangling us, doesn't it? And property. Well, that can make even good neighbours rather unreasonable. The Reverend said nothing. He stared into his tea. Miss Marple continued conversationally. I've been thinking, Inspector, about the matter of that missing silver tray. It strikes me as rather curious. Not so much the theft itself, but the timing. Inspector Harrington leaned forward. Go on, Miss Marple. Well, she said, it disappeared after Mr. Carraway's death, didn't it? That suggests the thief had a particular purpose. Perhaps not theft at all, but concealment. You see, silver shows stains rather badly. Even a drop or two of blood would leave a trace impossible to polish away completely. Mrs. Dobbins gasped. Mrs. Penrose dropped her teaspoon with a clatter. The Reverend looked up sharply, his face suddenly pale. Miss Marple sipped her tea, unhurried. Oh, I dare say the tray will turn up somewhere quite unexpected. One does tend to hide things in haste, you know. The silence that followed was deep and taut. Only the clock ticked softly on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple set down her cup and looked mildly out the window. By the time her guests departed, she had seen all she needed. Mrs. Dobbins had chattered nervously. Mrs. Penrose had feigned indifference, and Inspector Harrington had looked quietly astonished. But Reverend Pettigrew, his calm had slipped. For all his moral authority, there had been something in his eyes. Not fear of sin, but fear of discovery. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a brief note and sent it to Inspector Harrington by hand. My dear Inspector, I believe you will find it useful to have a word with Reverend Pettigrew. Discreetly, of course. You might inquire whether he has been doing any cleaning of late, particularly in the church vestry. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She folded it neatly, sealed it, and smiled to herself. The trap, now delicately set, needed only the smallest tremor to spring. And in Willowbrook, where guilt and conscience could never rest easy, Miss Marple knew that tremor would come sooner than anyone expected. Outside twilight gathered, and the church bell tolled the hour. Somewhere in the village, a restless soul stirred, unaware that the calm, white-haired lady who served tea so sweetly had just unravelled the web of lies spun so carefully around them. The afternoon was unnaturally still when Miss Marple made her quiet way to the vicarage drawing-room. She had requested the presence of just a few individuals. Mr. Hawthorne, Inspector Graves, Mrs. Pritchard, and the newly returned Mr. Thomas. Waverley, who had come back from London that morning looking a trifle worn and uneasy. It was not the sort of gathering that seemed ominous at first glance. Tea was laid out on the polished table, the lace cloth freshly pressed, and the clock ticked decorously in the corner. Yet there was a peculiar air of expectancy, as though everyone had come knowing that something final was to be said. Miss Marple, who sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, did not begin at once. She seemed content to let the silence linger until it grew taut and uncomfortable. Finally she said in her gentle, almost apologetic tone, "I think, perhaps, the time has come to speak plainly about poor Mr. Pritchard's death, and about who truly caused it." Mrs. Pritchard stiffened. The others looked at her with concern, but she remained perfectly still, her gloved hands clasped in her lap. "The police," Miss Marple continued, "were naturally led to certain conclusions. Mr. Ellis's quarrel with the deceased, the missing funds, his attempt to flee. All quite convincing, if one looked at it only from the surface. But the trouble with surfaces, I've always thought, is that they are rather good at hiding what lies beneath." Inspector Graves frowned but said nothing. Miss Marple smiled faintly at him. "You see, Inspector, human beings don't commit murder because they are wicked in the abstract. They do it because they believe they must, to protect themselves or someone they love, or something they cannot bear to lose. Once you find what that something is, the rest becomes rather simple." Mr. Waverley shifted uneasily. "I don't quite see where this is leading, Miss Marple." "I believe you do," she said kindly. "You see, Mr. Waverley, you were not at the fair when the murder occurred, or so you told everyone. But Miss Carter saw your car turning into the back lane behind the schoolhouse just before the fireworks began. She thought nothing of it at the time, but the timing is suggestive, don't you think?" Mr. Hawthorne looked startled. "But what possible reason—" "Oh, come now," Miss Marple murmured. "We all know about your engagement to Miss Lydia Fairchild, and how it came to an end rather abruptly after your father's death. Mr. Pritchard, I think, knew something about that, something you preferred to keep quiet. A letter, perhaps? A small but inconvenient piece of blackmail?" Waverley's face drained of colour. "That's absurd, indeed." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Then how curious that the envelope found in Mr. Pritchard's desk bore your handwriting. You see, I took the liberty of comparing it. One does notice such things when one's eyes aren't as good as they used to be. It makes one pay attention to shape rather than detail." Mrs. Pritchard gasped softly, but Miss Marple did not look at her. Her gaze remained fixed upon Waverley, whose breath had grown shallow. "You meant only to retrieve the letter," she said. "I dare say you had no intention of harm at first, but there was an argument. Perhaps he threatened you, perhaps he laughed, and in the heat of it you struck him. The blow wasn't meant to kill, but it did. Panic followed. And then, well, you're not the first man to tidy up a terrible mistake and call it mischance." The room seemed to close in around them. Mr. Waverley looked from face to face, his composure disintegrating. Finally, he slumped forward, his voice hoarse. "He wouldn't stop," he muttered. "He said he'd ruin Lydia, drag her name through the mud, unless I paid him again. I couldn't bear it." Inspector Graves rose at once, grave but not unkind. "I'll need you to come with me, sir." There was no struggle. Waverley stood, straightened his coat, and went quietly. When the door closed behind them, a strange stillness returned. Mrs. Pritchard, pale but composed, said softly, "You knew, didn't you, Miss Marple, long before today?" Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. "Oh, I suspected. Not of him precisely, but that we were all looking in the wrong direction. You see, wickedness often hides beneath very decent manners. And sometimes, she added with a small sigh, good people do very foolish things when they think they are protecting those they love. Mrs. Pritchard said nothing, but her eyes glistened. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly, rose from her chair, and said with gentle finality, I think, perhaps, it's time for another cup of tea. Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour, its slow, echoing chime spreading across Willowbrook. The fairgrounds were empty now, the bunting gone, the laughter forgotten. And yet, in the still air, something like peace had returned. Quiet, delicate, and entirely Miss Marple's doing. A soft October rain fell upon Willowbrook, blurring the cottage windows and turning the lanes into thin silver ribbons of mud. The fair had long since ended, and with it the fever of rumour and suspicion that had gripped the village. Yet there was still one final conversation to be had, and it took place, fittingly, in Miss Marple's small rose-scented sitting-room. The fire was lit, crackling merrily despite the damp. A tea-tray rested on the low table, and Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, sat with her usual gentle composure. Across from her sat Inspector Graves, notebook closed, his manner softened by something like respect. I must say, he began, you had us all looking in circles, Miss Marple. How in heaven's name did you see it? Everyone thought Ellis the shopkeeper was guilty. Even I did. Miss Marple gave a modest smile. Well, Inspector, Ellis was a most convenient suspect. People are so easily persuaded by appearances, and Ellis had the misfortune to look the part. But you see, human behaviour rather follows patterns, especially in a small place like Willowbrook. I simply noticed which patterns did not fit. Graves leaned forward. Go on. First, Miss Marple said, there was the matter of Mr. Pritchard's pocket watch. Everyone assumed it had stopped during the struggle, fixing the time of death. But it hadn't stopped at all. It had been wound tightly after the fact. A frightened man like Ellis would never have thought to do that. But a man like Mr. Waverley, tidy, controlled, desperate to make things appear neat, might well have done so. Graves nodded slowly. And the letter? Ah, yes, the letter. It was the key, of course. When I heard Mrs. Pritchard mention her husband's important correspondence, I knew he'd been using something to his advantage. When I later found an envelope addressed in a younger hand, well, it was quite clear the handwriting didn't belong to any villager I knew. A bit too refined, you see. And when Mr. Waverley returned from London so suddenly, and seemed so nervous about the police investigation, it all fell rather neatly into place. She paused to pour more tea, her hands steady despite her age. Then there was his behaviour at the fete. He told everyone he was driving to Little Densham for a meeting. Yet Miss Carter, who is a most observant young lady, if one takes the trouble to listen to her, saw his car parked behind the schoolhouse, near the very lane Mr. Pritchard was later found. A small detail, but a telling one. Inspector Graves rubbed his chin. So you set your trap? Miss Marple nodded mildly. I simply asked those who were involved to come together and let truth do the rest. You see, Inspector, guilt has a way of showing itself if you give it the right sort of silence to sit in. One doesn't need threats or tricks, only patience and a little kindness. Sooner or later, the truth becomes quite unbearable to hide. There was a long pause, broken only by the rain tapping gently at the window. At At last Graves said, "It's a remarkable thing, Miss Marple. You've the instincts of a detective born." "Oh, my dear Inspector," she said, smiling, "I'm nothing of the kind. I simply pay attention to people. I've known all sorts in my time. Liars, fools, saints, and the sort of souls who can be all three at once. In villages like this, one learns to see the small things. Who glances away too quickly, who avoids a subject, who polishes their shoes more than usual after a crime. People tell you what they've done, if you're quiet enough to hear it." Graves chuckled softly. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she replied gently. "But it isn't easy." They shared a companionable silence. When the clock chimed 4, Miss Marple rose to fetch another log for the fire. "You'll stay for another cup, Inspector?" she asked. "I think I will, thank you." Outside, the village of Willowbrook seemed at peace again. The baker's boy called cheerfully as he passed. The church bell rang the hour, and Mrs. Carter was hanging her washing beneath the dripping apple trees. Life, as it always did in English villages, was quietly mending itself. The dark thing that had cast its shadow over their fare was gone, explained, confessed, and tidied away. But in Miss Marple's calm blue eyes there was still a trace of something thoughtful, for she knew, as she always did, that the world was never quite as innocent as it pretended to be. Beneath every polite smile there lingered the possibility of folly, jealousy, or despair, and yet, she thought, setting down her cup with a faint smile, there was also kindness, the quiet kind, the sort that endured. The fire flickered, the rain fell softly, and in the heart of Willowbrook, peace returned once more. It was evening in Willowbrook. The rain had ceased at last, leaving the cobbles slick and shining beneath a lavender sky. The faint scent of wet lilac drifted from the churchyard wall, and a thin curl of smoke rose from every chimney, turning the village into a watercolour of calm domesticity. Miss Marple sat in her garden, a shawl about her shoulders, her knitting abandoned for once upon the wicker chair beside her. She was watching the sparrows dart between the hedges, her thoughts wandering gently, not to the past few weeks of violence and deceit, but to the quiet resilience of life itself. It always astonished her, the way peace returned after wickedness, the way people preferred to smooth away unpleasantness, to resume their routines as if nothing dreadful had ever happened. Mrs. Carter was again gossiping at the greengrocer's. The vicar's wife had resumed her committee meetings, and even the children were laughing once more as they skipped past the spot on the green where poor Mr. Pritchard had been found. Yes, life went on. It always did. The door creaked softly, and a familiar voice called from the hall, "A letter for you, Miss Marple. From London, I believe." It was her housekeeper, Martha, holding a pale envelope. Miss Marple took it, her smile faint but amused. She recognized the handwriting at once. Inspector Graves. She opened it carefully, her eyes brightening as she read. "Dear Miss Marple, I thought you'd be pleased to know that Mr. Waverley's confession has been received and accepted. The Crown will proceed with leniency, given his failing health and evident remorse. I must again thank you for your insight, without which I suspect justice might have taken a very different turn. With sincere admiration, James Graves." Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and set it upon her lap. "Poor man," she murmured. "He was not evil, only frightened, and fear, you know, can make monsters of the mildest souls." Martha looked at her curiously. "Do you ever get used to it, ma'am? The wickedness, I mean." Miss Marple smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that had unsettled so many complacent hearts. "No, my dear, one never gets used to it, but one must understand it. People aren't born wicked. They lose their way. Often for the smallest of reasons. love, pride, a little jealousy. It's all rather like knitting, really. One dropped stitch and the whole pattern goes awry." Martha chuckled softly. "You do make things sound simple." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not simple, only human." A breeze stirred the roses along the fence, scattering a few petals across the grass. The day's last light fell upon them, turning them to faint embers before they vanished into dusk. Miss Marple stood and looked toward the church tower, where the bell tolled 7. The sound echoed gently through the valley, a sound of endings and beginnings, of forgiveness and forgetfulness. In a few days' time, she knew, life in Willowbrook would resume its perfect little rhythm. The market would bustle, the Sunday service would be full, and the memory of murder would fade into village legend, whispered perhaps over tea, embroidered slightly with each telling. And as for Miss Marple, she would return to her garden, to her knitting, to her quiet watchfulness. For in every peaceful English village she knew, there were stories waiting just beneath the surface, and when the next one stirred, as surely it would, she would be there again, with her patient eyes and her gentle, devastating truth. The rain began once more, light and steady. Miss Marple turned back toward her warm, lamplit cottage, closing the gate behind her with a soft click. The world, for the moment, was at peace. The following Sunday was bright and clear, the air washed clean by days of rain. From early morning, the sound of church bells drifted gently over Willowbrook, summoning the villagers with a reassurance that all was right once more. The fairgrounds, once the scene of laughter and tragedy alike, had been tidied and reseeded. Only the faintest outline in the grass betrayed where the canvas stalls had stood. Ghosts of merriment, now replaced by daisies and new life. Miss Marple arrived at St. Michael's a few minutes early. As was her habit, she paused outside the lych gate, taking in the familiar sight of the village she loved so dearly. Children ran ahead of their parents, ribbons fluttering. Mrs. Carter was fussing with her hatpin, and the vicar stood by the porch, shaking hands with those who entered. To any passing visitor, it would have looked the picture of English harmony. Peaceful, innocent, untroubled, but Miss Marple, in her quiet way, knew better. She always did. Beneath the polished surface of every village lay the same timeless truths. Kindness and cruelty, generosity and greed, love and envy, they coexisted, interwoven like the threads of her knitting, impossible to separate without unravelling the whole. Inside the church, sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering colours upon the pews. The vicar's sermon that morning spoke of redemption, of how even the gravest sins could, through repentance, find their way to mercy. Miss Marple listened with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression mild, her thoughts far away. She had seen too much of human weakness to expect perfection, and yet she believed, quite stubbornly, in the small, enduring goodness that persisted all the same. When the service ended, she joined the stream of parishioners in the churchyard. There was laughter again and talk of harvest suppers and charity drives. Someone mentioned that the fair might return next year, if people feel ready for it. The remark drew a ripple of uneasy smiles, but Miss Marple said nothing. She only nodded, her eyes gentle but knowing. "Terrible business, that murder," said Mr. Finch, the grocer, falling into step beside her. "Still, all's well that ends well, eh?" "All's well, that's understood," Miss Marple corrected softly, "though I dare say few ever truly do." He looked puzzled, but she only smiled and continued along the lane, the sound of the bells fading behind her. By afternoon, the village had returned to its rhythm. Miss Marple took her tea in the garden, the cup trembling slightly in the autumn breeze. She watched a pair of robins quarrel over crumbs, their feathers puffed in righteous indignation. "Dear me," she murmured, amused. "Even in the animal world, pride refuses to yield." On the table beside her lay a folded copy of the Times. The headline was simple enough: "Confession in Willowbrook Murder. Local businessman admits to fatal struggle." She had read it earlier once and set it aside. There was nothing in it she didn't already know. The world, she reflected, always demanded explanations, as though neat words could tidy away the discomfort of evil. But true understanding required more than statements. It required compassion. The church bell struck 4. Somewhere down the lane, a piano began to play. A hesitant waltz that drifted faintly on the wind. Children's laughter echoed near the green, and life, as it always did, continued its steady march forward. Miss Marple smiled faintly, rising to gather her shawl. "Another stitch finished," she murmured, glancing at her knitting basket, "and another small corner of wickedness mended, at least for a while." As the sun dipped low, casting the village in a golden hush, she stood for a long moment at her gate, gazing at the quiet street. The world was not perfect, nor would it ever be. But it was, in its way, endlessly fascinating, and that, to Miss Marple, was comfort enough. With that, she turned and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The kettle began to whistle, the clock ticked steadily, and in the heart of Willowbrook, Miss Marple, the quiet sentinel of truth, sat once more by her fire, content, watchful, and ready, should the peace ever tremble again. The weeks that followed were the gentlest Willowbrook had known in years. The leaves turned amber and gold, the air carried that faint wood-smoke scent, which made every cottage window glow warmer at dusk. Yet for all its peace, there lingered in the village an undercurrent, not fear now, but reflection. People spoke more softly in the post-office queue, greeted one another with greater kindness, as if, in the wake of tragedy, each had remembered how fragile the calm of their small world truly was. Miss Marple noticed it, of course. She always noticed such things, the subtle shifts in human nature, the small adjustments people made when they had brushed too close to darkness. Mrs. Carter, for instance, had grown uncharacteristically gentle in her gossip, qualifying each remark with, "Poor dear, I don't suppose she meant it." The vicar's wife organised a fund for Mr. Pritchard's orphaned niece. Even young Tommy Finch, who had once been caught throwing pebbles at the baker's hens, now delivered firewood to the church without being asked. Life, Miss Marple reflected, was very much like a garden after a storm. One must tidy what could be mended, accept what was lost, and take comfort in the quiet persistence of growth. That afternoon, she sat by her parlour window, sunlight falling across her lace curtains, a half-finished sock on her knitting needles. On the mantel lay the inspector's final letter, brief, respectful, and full of gratitude. "Your observations have been invaluable once again, Miss Marple," it read. "I sometimes think you see further than any of us, not because you have sharper eyes, but because you understand the heart. I hope when the next puzzle arises, you'll allow us to trouble you again." She smiled faintly as she reread it. "Oh, I dare say there will be another puzzle soon enough," she murmured, reaching for her tea. "There always is in a village." From the lane came the sound of a milk cart rattling past, followed by the laughter of children chasing after it. Somewhere a dog barked. The world was returning, stitch by stitch, to its ordinary self. Her gaze drifted to the roses outside her window. A few late blooms clinging bravely against the cold. Their beauty, she thought, was a little like truth, quiet, persistent, and sometimes thorny to the touch. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Faces passed through her mind. Mr. Waverley's strained confession, the tearful relief of Mrs. Pritchard, the shocked whispered sympathy of the villagers. Each of them, in their way, had played a part in the tapestry of the crime, and yet she felt no triumph in having solved it, only a kind of tender melancholy. For the waste of a good mind, a good man, undone by pride and fear. When the clock struck 5, Miss Marple stirred. She rose, drew the curtains, and lit her lamp. The warm glow filled the little room. Glancing off the teacups and polished silver frame that held a photograph of her long-departed nephew, she regarded it fondly. "You were right, dear Edward," she said softly. "There is nothing quite so interesting as human nature, nor so endlessly surprising." Outside, the first frost was beginning to form on the cobbles. The air carried that unmistakable stillness that precedes winter, the calm between one season and the next. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, poured the last of the tea, and settled by the fire. She did not look triumphant, nor even particularly pleased. She simply looked, as she always did, quietly content, quietly watchful. Somewhere beyond the village, a train whistle blew, faint and far away, as though carrying the echo of another mystery waiting to unfold. Miss Marple smiled to herself. "Well," she said gently, "perhaps there will be time yet for one more." And with that, she returned to her knitting, the fire crackling softly, the night drawing in, and all of Willowbrook at peace for now. The frost had come at last. Each morning the fields beyond Willowbrook shimmered white, and the hedgerows glittered like lace in the weak winter sun. The village, wrapped in mist and chimney smoke, seemed to doze contentedly after its long season of unease. Even the air itself felt cleaner, as though the earth had drawn a long, steady breath after holding it for too long. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, gazing across the lane where the last rose of the season trembled on its stem. Pale, fragile, but refusing to fall. A small wistful smile touched her lips. "You and I," she said softly to the bloom. "We've both outlasted the storm, haven't we?" Behind her, the kettle began to whistle faintly through the open kitchen window, and the faint murmur of the wireless carried the afternoon news. London scandals, foreign politics, the world in motion, all very far from Willowbrook, which existed in its own unhurried time. The villagers had returned in full measure to their lives. Mrs. Carter's laughter was again heard in the grocer's. Reverend Pettigrew's sermons had turned lighter, his smile warmer. Even young Jenny, once so pale from fear, now walked each morning with the baker's boy, and blushed when greeted by name. The fair's tragedy had become a memory, softened by distance, and soon, Miss Marple knew, it would pass entirely into story. As she turned back toward the cottage, she paused, sensing a movement behind her. It was the postman, his breath clouding in the chill air. "Morning, Miss Marple. Cold one today, eh? Letter for you." "Thank you, Mr. Giles," she said pleasantly. The envelope was cream-coloured, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it at her small desk, where sunlight fell in a golden square upon her lace runner. The letter was from an old acquaintance in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Penrose, inviting her to visit after Christmas. "Do come, my dear Jane," it read. "We've had the oddest little trouble at the manor. Nothing serious, but quite puzzling. I dare say your sharp eyes might enjoy it." Miss Marple smiled as she folded the letter, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. "Ah," she murmured, "so the world stirs again." Outside, a robin landed upon the window-sill and tilted its head toward her, curious and bright-eyed. She scattered a few crumbs from her saucer and watched it hop closer, utterly fearless. "You see," she told it kindly, "there's always another mystery, another heart to untangle. It never truly ends, and thank heaven for that." She poured her tea, savouring the warmth against her hands. The fire glowed steadily. The clock ticked on, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. The last rose trembled, loosing its final petal. It drifted downward, soundless and sure, coming to rest upon the frost like a sigh. Miss Marple watched it fall, then closed the window gently. "Rest now," she whispered almost to herself. "All's well in Willowbrook." And so the curtain drew quietly upon the village, its cottages serene, its secrets at peace. The fair was gone, the laughter and the sorrow both fading into memory. But in one small parlour, beneath the soft hum of the kettle, a wise old woman sat waiting, calm, watchful, and timeless, as all of England turned toward another dawn. The desert was still, the night had fallen heavy, and the ruins shimmered faintly beneath a cold, silver moon. The expedition camp had gone quiet, save for the soft hiss of the wind gliding across the dunes, like the breath of something ancient, watching, waiting. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood alone before the gate they had unearthed, the same gate the locals once called the Door of the Forgotten. Her lantern flickered against the carvings, revealing figures not of gods or kings, but of ordinary people, weeping, reaching, fading into the stone. It was as though the city itself had mourned its own death. Inside the ruins, she could feel the faint hum beneath her feet, that low rhythmic pulse that had haunted them since the excavation began. Some claimed it was the earth settling, others something older, alive. Evelyn wasn't sure any more. She ran her hand over a crumbling inscription and whispered the translation she had pieced together over sleepless nights. "We built our heaven in the sand, and the sand took it back." Tears welled in her eyes. After months of digging, she finally understood. This city wasn't destroyed by war, nor swallowed by time. It was buried by its own people, a desperate act to keep something, or someone, from ever walking the earth again. A sudden gust of wind swept through, extinguishing her light. In the darkness, the hum grew louder, deeper, almost like a heartbeat. Then a whisper. It was faint, nearly lost to the desert air. Her name. "Evelyn." She froze. The ruins trembled. For a moment she thought she saw movement, shadows where none should be, eyes glinting like stars beneath the sand. She stepped back toward the gate, heart pounding, the realization striking like lightning. This city was never truly dead. It was waiting. And as the moon sank below the horizon, the first grains of sand began to shift again, sliding softly over the stones, as if the desert itself were closing its eyes. The city would sleep once more, but the echo of its story would never fade. At dawn, the horizon glowed faintly, a thin line of gold against the endless dunes. The camp, once alive with noise and laughter, now lay abandoned. The wind had erased every footprint, every trace of tents and tools. Only the ruins remained, quiet and eternal. Dr. Evelyn Hart's notebook was found 3 days later, half buried in the sand by a rescue team from Cairo. The pages fluttered in the wind like the wings of a dying bird. Inside, the last entry was brief, written in hurried strokes, as though she had no time left. It wasn't built for the living, that was all. No coordinates, no explanation. No body was ever recovered. When the report reached the British Museum, it was filed neatly under Unresolved Expedition Incidents, 1953. A few academics read it, a few whispered theories over brandy in dim lecture halls, and then, as time does, it swallowed the story whole, but not entirely. Years later, a Bedouin trader passing through the same valley swore he saw strange lights shimmering beneath the dunes at night. Faint, golden ripples moving like the reflection of a city underwater. He said he heard music too, soft, echoing, distant. When he approached, the lights vanished, and the wind fell still, as though holding its breath. They say the desert never truly forgets. It only waits. And somewhere beneath 1,000 tons of sand, an ancient heartbeat still hums, steady, patient, eternal, carrying the memory of a civilization that once dreamed it could live forever. The dream failed, but the echo remains,